Okay, so hi everyone. Today I have Ryan Mullins with me. He is, I think, one of the best philosophers of religion working in the field right now. I think he's legendary. So, would you like to introduce to ourselves, Dr. Ryan?
Yeah, so like you said, I'm Dr. Ryan Mullins. I'm at the Collegium for Advanced Studies at the University of Helsinki, and then starting soon, I'll become a visiting professor of philosophy at Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida and the University of Lucerne in Switzerland.
Okay, great. So I suppose my first question is perhaps like, so I read that you love metal bands. You know,
Yeah,
what's your favorite one, I suppose?
the Black Dahlia Murder is probably one of my favorites. They're this band from Detroit that I think I've been following since I was like maybe like 20. So like yeah, I've been following them for a long time. I've seen them in the U.S. I've seen them in Scotland a couple times. So yeah, they're one of my favorites.
Yeah, I mean, metal bands. I mean, sometimes I'm generally more of perhaps rock fan, post
Mhm.
rock and stuff like that, rather than metal and stuff because the drumming can be really aggressive and it just sounds funny to me sometimes. Like,
Yeah, that's fair.
like why are you so? And then the screaming can be too much sometimes. So
It's a lot. It's a lot. So yeah.
So I generally do not listen to metal that much, but it's cool sometimes. So, anyways, one of the things that I was thinking about perhaps is that how did you like get into philosophy of religion specifically?
hmm Yeah, that was more of a personal thing for me because it was when I was in undergrad. I originally started out doing like a TV and radio. Like I was gonna go into like eventually go to film school, and I took a philosophy class and then a theology class, and it was asking the questions that I wanted answers to. And so I just kind of got addicted from there. Like I wanted to know, does God exist? I wanted to know, what is God like? And those were the types of questions that they were addressing. And then a bunch of specific questions within Christianity that I just wanted to know more about my own Christian faith. And so I just got addicted. So it was really just purely personal reasons of just going, I need to know more.
I think that's interesting because, well, philosophy of religion, especially, is addictive in my view. Like, it's very interesting, and I mean, it also has like actual consequences on lives of people.
hmm
I think belief in God in some senses like helps, like it helps mental health, I think. I mean, there were, I think, statistics which suggest that people who believe in God are generally happier,
hmm
something like that. So I think, I mean, if I think in one of your papers, it was on perhaps open and relational theology, where you talked about, you know, uh, like you really want to be immortal,
hmm
you do not just want to be like remembered in the memory or something like that, and I agree. Like the whole thing with like just death right there and end,
hmm
I think that's terrifying. It's seriously weird. How the thing is, one thing that opened me to like belief in God is because of you, Joshua Rasmussen, and other philosophers like you. And and like I was like before being the neo-classical kind of
hmm
theist or open theist, I was leaning toward classical form of theism because like internet Thomists or internet theists told me that it's the best version or something.
Right.
And then I heard you define it and actually put it forward as it is. Now, even without your objections, I thought, this is No, I do not. I don't. No, just no. That's not the kind of theism that I hold to. Like that's just the weirdest, strangest kind of theism that
You're
you
not
could.
the first person to tell me that, because there's a lot of people, when I just simply define like divine simplicity or impassibility, like all I have to do is just describe. I'm like, this is literally what the view is, and sometimes people go, all right, I'm done. I got like
Yeah.
I'm already out just by after me describing it. So yeah, this is a common experience, which I find really fascinating. That just simply describing a view is enough sometimes to make people go, I can't accept this.
Yeah, I mean, it's one reason is because as you have said in multiple videos that it contradicts biblical data and stuff like that. Along with that, people cannot. I do not think there is any way to connect with a God who is just doesn't care about anyone but himself.
Yeah, it's that's some I've got a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Analytic Theology called Closeness with God, a problem for impassibility. And that's something where I think I finally got really precise on what is at play here. And because a lot of times people will say, yes, you cannot be close to an impassible God. You cannot be close to a timeless being. You cannot be close, and I think there's an intuition there, but trying to get the argument just right is a bit more tricky than I think a lot of people realize. So yeah, so but I think I finally got the argument more precise. So here's the idea. So in order to be close to someone, there's several different conditions you need to be able to satisfy. You need to know what they're like, and then and you need to be able to share in their projects to some extent. And it needs to be the case that they've not deceived you in any sort of way.
Yeah.
And you've understood whatever they've revealed to you.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, cool. So let's look at what God's revealed. And the claim, at least if you're a Christian or a Jew and you look at just the Old Testament alone, the Hebrew Bible makes a really big deal about God being compassionate and being rich in mercy, rich in empathy, and all these kind of things. And you're like, okay, so that's what God's revealed to us, that he has empathy, that he has compassion, that he has mercy. And then you look at the classical theistic tradition, and what do they say? They say God does not literally have empathy. God does not have compassion. God does not literally have mercy. And you're like, okay, so has God deceived me? And they're like, well, I mean, maybe. Here's the problem: you're stupid. You don't know anything. So God has to reveal himself to you as you see him. And this is the view that John Calvin affirms. God reveals himself to you as you see him because you're too stupid, and so he works with that. And so this is supposed to be an accommodation. And I don't know about you, but like if I told you consistently that I am the exact opposite of what I am like, just because I'm like, Rajat, you're too stupid to understand. I don't know what that really. I mean, I think it says a lot about me as a person.
Yeah, like you are like catfishing me.
Yes, exactly. It's this divine catfishing. And and I'm like, well, that's a big problem for being close to someone. And then even when you do learn that they're a catfish, you do finally understand exactly who they are. Is that really the kind of person you want to be like in a relationship with? Like, I want to say no. I'm sorry. Like,
No, yeah.
no.
And I learned the word catfishing from you, by the
Okay,
way. Yeah.
it's a good
Like,
American word. Yeah, it's a good American English word. Yeah.
yeah. Like it's so weird with the whole like so Maimonides, uh, the philosopher
Mm-hmm.
who was I think believed in Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
He was a classical theist, weirdly. Like I don't know what happened. What happened?
I don't know, because this is something so one of the projects I'm up to is trying to look at all the different models of God and then see the representatives in the different world religions. Because one of the things that's really fascinating is when you look at the history of ideas, not just in like Western philosophy, but also like within a lot of Hindu philosophy too, you see all the different models of God pop up within the religions themselves. And when you look at Judaism, you look at the scriptures, you look at the rabbinical tradition, you don't really see classical theism. And then all of a sudden Maimonides pops up and it's like a really clear, like kind of classical theism. But then around the same time, you've got this other guy named Gersonides. And Gersonides is an open theist, which I'm like, an open theist that early in history. That's mind blowing. Someone who's just like, yeah, God can't know the future because there's no truth about the future. And you're just like, you look like you're a 20th century thinker. And he's like, no, I'm medieval. So So yeah, I don't know. I don't fully understand how some of these things come together, like how these histories evolve. And so Maimonides is an interesting case because he does look like a lot of the classical theists around him in the Christian tradition, but within the Jewish tradition, I don't know how much he looks like the other Jewish thinkers. So he's an interesting case, and I don't know the history enough there to really make a good statement on it.
Hmm. You know, perhaps I suppose this would be a different question
Mhm.
than your work. Like one of the things, like you talked about Iona Pat Salidu, right?
Oh yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
universalism. I think you believe that her work is kind of uh, makes sense, even though it is anti-universalist.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. Oh, so you want me to just okay? So I'll try to set up her argument for you. So she's got this interesting objection to universalism. I don't know where she actually stands. I don't know if she thinks everyone goes to heaven or not, because I've
yeah,
only read a couple of her papers, and I've not seen more from her on this. But she looks at all the contemporary universalists, so people like Thomas Talbot, Marilyn Adams, and then John Hick. They've got these really good arguments for universal salvation, that everyone will eventually go to heaven. But on each of their accounts, what you end up having is you die, you have some sort of afterlife experience, and God has to punish you, because you weren't a very good person, so you need
yeah,
some kind of punishment,
yeah,
uh, and uh, and then God continues to punish you until you eventually do repent and accept His offer of friendship and enter into a meaningful relationship. And what Pat Saladin does, what she asks is, she's like, how exactly do you get that without coercion?
yeah,
Because it seems like it might be the case that he's beating the hell out of you. And sometimes the universalists will joke about that. They'll say, yeah, God, you get the experience of God, and God beats the hell out of you. And then you need to get into heaven. And she's like, yeah, but if you actually are doing that, then you're really twisting someone's arm into a friendship. And
yeah.
because the only reason they're saying, yes, fine, I'll be friends with you, is because they want this punishment to stop. And she asks, is that really a genuine repentance? Is that really a genuine friendship? And I think that's a really good question. It's a really difficult question to
Yeah,
answer. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting argument. I think it's got some teeth to it. So I think it's got some force.
yeah, interesting. Though, I mean, I think universalism can be, perhaps thought about in different ways.
Hmm.
Like, so one thing you could say is, look, when you commit a crime, you deserve punishment. God is not punishing you to get you to heaven.
Hmm.
God is punishing you because you deserve it.
Yeah.
After you go through the suffering, then God can allow you to, accept God, or like perhaps, like the whole thing with like rejecting God is like, first of all, does not make any sense to me. Like, I mean, what do we mean by rejecting? Like, if he's literally the source of life and
Hmm.
happiness and all that good stuff, rejecting literally means death. That's one thing. But perhaps someone might just want to say, look, I do not like you, I just want to stay away, like 100 miles away or something,
Yeah.
right? Someone can do that. So perhaps, like, after, so suppose a person who is like a psychopath, right?
Hmm.
Absolute psychopath, he did horrible things, and he gets punished in hell for, like, because he deserves it, he suffers there for some time. After he suffers, there is some sort of rehabilitation, correction, and then he like gets out. But even after getting out, he says, like, look, I still kind of do not like you, and since you think I'm dangerous or something, you can
Hmm.
like put me in some sort of a good chill place where I'm away from people. I get to just play video games and stuff,
Hmm.
listen to music, metal, and like just enjoy my life without hurting anyone. I do not
Hmm.
hurt you. No one gets hurt. Everything is cool. I'm cool. You're cool. I mean, that sounds like great. But again, this is assuming that the psychopath is unrepairable, because generally
Hmm.
psychopaths are like mentally
Right.
ill. So empathy generation by God would be like very easy to me.
it does, because this is a point that Talbot and then well, you had Eric Rattan on your show before, and his co-author with John Cronin. This is an argument they make, saying like, okay, if there's certain things that are impairing you, that impairing you and that preventing you from entering into a relationship with God, well, surely God's going to be able to do something to remove that impairment. And if it's psychopathy or some other kind of mental illness, it seems like God should be able to do something to heal that, is the kind of argument they make. But it still might be the case that the psychopath's just got this moral character that he's developed, where he's just like, yeah, God, I don't I don't want you, so I want to go off and be somewhere else. And there are various people like C.S. Lewis who would say, well, that's fine, you could talk about it being a good place to some extent, but that would still be hell, because there's certain great goods that you are missing out on, which are great goods with God, and then the great goods of being in a relationship with the community of God, so all the people. And so being off by yourself, maybe that works for a while. But I don't know if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. So he has this, it's this kind of sci-fi novel about heaven and hell. And there's all these people who, they're in this city, and it turns out the city is hell. And they can take a bus and go up to heaven and see if they want to stay there or not. And then various people, they decide, I'm going to stick around in hell. And so what you have with these characters that are in hell, it's just a normal city, but they keep fighting with each other. They keep bickering and just like don't really get along very well, because they're not that great of people. And some of them just leave the city. They go out into the countryside and they get farther and farther away. And one of them tells a story of finding Napoleon, because apparently Napoleon Bonaparte was in hell, and he decided, I don't want to have anything to do with any of you people. And he goes out like just way out into the distance, way out into the countryside of hell, and builds a big mansion for himself. And he's just in the mansion by himself. And so some of the people, they go out to find him, and he's just a madman, because just the sheer isolation that he's put himself in makes himself go crazy. And so they can't have a meaningful conversation with him.
Yes.
So the psychological effects of that kind of isolation,
Yeah.
Those are very serious. And I think in a lot of people, now that we've gone through various lockdowns over this pandemic, the reality of isolation, how it's not very pleasant, that really does, I think, would get to you after a while. So it might seem like a kind of cool place where you can play video games for a while. I don't know how sustainable that is in the long run, though.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as you said, right, like he becomes a madman. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, it could be that it's our nature, mm-hmm. It's not God who has like specifically tweaked something. It could be that our nature, that we cannot, live without we cannot completely separate ourselves from community and God and friends, family and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. We need people, we need God. So I do not think Pat Saladin's argument would work then, if C.S. Lewis' version of kind of hell is true. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, the traditional view of hell was Augustinian, right? Like, you will be tortured, and you are going to really dislike it. Mm-hmm. And you wish you were not born or something like that. Like God mm-hmm. will make sure that your skin will regenerate so that it can burn again. So that's the thing, right? Like, there are two views of eternal hell. And I mean, I do not think if C.S. Lewis's view of eternal hell, I'm not even sure if that's really that bad, or it does not sound that bad.
It doesn't sound as bad, but because that was one of the things that struck me when I first read it, was it doesn't sound that bad. And he has this really famous statement of like, the gates of hell are locked from the inside. Yeah, it's people who are like, I don't want to be in friendship with God. And I do think there is a very intuitive sense in which you can say it doesn't sound as bad because you're not in a lake of fire, so you're not being tortured.
Yeah.
But then when I reflect on the kind of psychological torment that you have when you are in awful relationships with people around you, and when you are in isolation, or you've got all this guilt or baggage, because I've had relationships with people who have very serious mental health issues, and they just look at themselves as awful people, and they can't ever forgive themselves for anything. And seeing the torment that they go through.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, if maybe C.S. Lewis's hell does sound actually quite quite terrible.
Okay,
It's
yeah,
more
yeah. I mean,
real. I guess it's more realistic because
yeah,
it's not all the like the flames and stuff you get in a horror movie.
yeah,
It's something that hits much closer to home.
yeah. So I would say that if that's the case, like people do get mentally really in a really horrific situation, then I think people will reach out, right? And I think
Hmm.
the person would be able to make certain decisions. I think, Robert J. Hartman is working on a paper. I
Hmm.
think his paper is going to be great
Yeah, yeah,
about that,
yeah. I've
probably.
seen an early draft of it, and it's where he gives an argument for universal salvation based on free will. It's interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think I like it. And I mean, I do not think that God would literally let the person deteriorate so much that he is just in complete torment, just become completely insane or something like that. I do
Hmm.
not think he would allow that. I mean, it's similar to, like, I would not allow my friend, like my friend has a libertarian free will. So I will, I'm not like, okay, he has libertarian free will. If he
Yeah.
chooses to like kill himself, I'll just let him. I'm not going to do that. I'm going
Yeah,
to,
you're not going to just well, you're going to do everything you can to prevent it, right? You're not going to
yes,
just
I'm
stand
going
by.
to do
Exactly.
everything I can to prevent it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think God succeeds in that ultimately. That's my view.
That's what I hope. But I just have these Pat Saladin kind of worries of how exactly do you pull that off, and all the ways that I've seen to pull it off, they have enough problems to make me just uncertain. Um, but I really want it to be true. I really do. Something my wife teases me about actually quite a bit is she's like, "You just want to save everyone," and I'm like, "Yes, I really do." Um, but yeah, but I'm uncertain because of some of the reasons. I can give you other reasons, but yeah, some of the reasons we've talked about that they do make me uncertain. But I wish I could get rid of that uncertainty.
Interesting. What are
Yeah.
some other reasons though?
Well, some people just they're so obstinate and just do not want to be friends with anyone, and they're just so belligerent. And so again, when I look at like C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, some of the characters in there, they just strike me as so real. Like I've met them. These people who they don't want to give up um there's kind of like their sinful characteristics that they've developed. They don't want to give them up, and or they want to have all the relationships on their own terms. um, and it's just like, I'm sorry, but no, like you have to respect other people's values, you have to respect other people's like, their freedom, their rights. And some people just go, no, 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 I want things on my own terms. This is how I want the world to revolve around me. And you go, I'm sorry, that's it's not how this works.
Yeah.
I don't know what it would take to convince those people to change their minds. I don't know. But if God has all of eternity to try to convince people to change their minds,
Yeah.
that leaves me hopeful.
I mean, people do change their minds, I think.
Hmm.
I mean, it's also about like how much does they think their ego is like getting
Yes.
in, like, you know, that they feel disrespected or something. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
So the thing is, I think if there is this mental health problem that if when they are alone, they feel really sad and stuff like that, I think they will automatically, come back rather than God doing anything. That's my view, because I mean,
Yeah.
when I'm suffering or something, even people with depression who are now people with depression technically want to just end themselves. So non-existence is better.
Exactly,
And
because that's the weird thing about depression or chronic low mood or dysthymia or these sorts of things is when you're experiencing one of those moments, you don't want to be around anyone. And
yeah,
you're like, but that's the exact thing you need to help snap you out of it, is you
yeah,
need like community, you need friendship. But the feeling is I don't want to be around anyone at all. And then if it's really extreme, then it's I don't even want to be, full stop. Like
yeah,
you don't want to exist.
yeah,
And so if that is what God is dealing with, that's going to be more complicated. And it might be the case that God just is able to just heal you of all of that in the
yeah,
afterlife.
yeah,
But if that's, here's one of the worries I have with this.
yeah,
And this kind of goes to actually a lot of different issues within Christian theology and broader theological views. So one claim is, well, okay, the reason God creates us with free will, there's many reasons to create us with free will, but one of the reasons for free will is that we can develop our own moral character. Because otherwise, if God just kind of snapped his fingers and zapped you and made you like perfectly good from the start, then you really wouldn't be perfectly good, because he'd programmed you to be perfectly good. And that's not really goodness. And if it's the case that in the eschaton, like God can just kind of snap his fingers and just like cure you of all your like mental foibles and all your vicious character traits and all that kind of stuff, if he can just do that instantly, then it seems like, well, why didn't you do that from the start? Why didn't you do that a lot sooner? And this is something like John Hick, who's a universalist, but he brings this objection up too, constantly, kind of going like, but why didn't God do that sooner? And it seems, and his answer is because that's not possible. You wouldn't be able to get beings with genuine freedom and genuine like moral virtue. It has to be something that you get yourself with help from others, because a lot of our virtuous character traits we develop with others. But on his view, it's and I find it plausible that God can't just zap you and make you better instantly.
Yeah.
So I find a pull to that. But again, I don't know.
God already was perfect.
Yeah, so God already was perfect. So he didn't have it
But
built from outside.
Yeah, he was already perfect, right? But he wants human beings to go through this
so that they can become perfect. Yeah.
I mean, he already had the good stuff from start, right?
Yeah.
Always, eternally.
Yeah.
And to demand that human beings do this, and I mean, only then that they can be happy if they do this, do these things.
Yes.
So first of all, I mean, of course, also depends on what kind of moral, normative, ethical view people have. Because if you have a broad normative, ethical view where, it's rights that matter, rather than, you have to like always do virtuous things, always be courageous, always do this, always be wise, and always stuff like that. But if generally morality is perhaps more, loose, I suppose, rather than really rigid, then perhaps there are possibilities that people can be happy. Like there could be degrees of, happiness, I suppose.
Oh yeah. Yes,
yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's two.
The person
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. You finish your thought, because I don't know where you're wanting to go with this.
Yeah, I was saying that there is like a kind of a minimum bar we have right now about people with depression and stuff like that. Like if they are like cutting themselves or doing something horrible, we do forcefully stop them. I mean, you could say that's coercion, but I mean, that's when doing that, most people, overwhelming majority, are thankful.
Oh yeah.
You stopped me. And even those, I think, who are unthankful, I think become perhaps thankful later or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, like depression is a mental illness, right? We want to say that that's a mental illness. We want to say that you are not okay when you are going insane like that.
Yeah.
And when you are not okay, there needs to be some intervention, extra intervention, physically or perhaps mentally. I think God can do non-invasive interventions, like for instance, psychopaths are like unrepaired. If God repairs the psychopaths, I do not think that's some kind of a bad invasive intervention. Now, of course, you talked about like developing this perfectly virtuous character, but that's the thing that, like, to me, it's doing what's morally permissible. That's enough. You do not need to be like, of course, to be very close to God, perhaps you need like really great virtuous character or something, like really close, like best friends ever, then you need to be. But people can be just friends rather than like close friends, right?
Yes.
And God can allow that rather than like making sure that that person suffers continuously. So I mean, there could be indeed less happiness to those people who do not want to stay with God, but I do not think it would be complete depression.
Yes.
That's my view.
Yeah, and I find that really plausible as well. So Marilyn Adams, her understanding is that, yeah, when you, after you die, God needs to give you an afterlife that's really worth living. So that way your life on the whole is one that is worth living.
Yeah.
And so any sort of suffering you've undergone, God has to compensate you for that.
Yeah.
And then God also has to transform your character.
Yeah.
And so when you get these kind of like Pat Saladou objections that I've laid out earlier,
Yeah, I mean, transforming
she'll,
character is something I'm not
you're
going
not,
to agree with that much, because it
sure.
depends,
Yeah.
like transform your character. This is the thing, right? Like, this is the thing with Christian theology and stuff.
Mhm.
I do not subscribe to that.
Sure.
I'm just a general theist. I
Yeah.
also like reject, other forms of theism. I was a Hindu. Then I
Mhm.
left it because I thought some things just seemed strange and weird, and like there also was, by the way, the torturous kind of hell,
Yeah, I knew
horrific
there's a
stuff.
bunch of hells in a lot of
Yeah, but it
Eastern
was
philosophy.
temporary though. It was
Mhm.
temporary. And Hinduism has an interesting view that you have infinite opportunities. World is eternal. There is
Right.
rebirth, cycles and stuff like that, and you might be able to get at some point to like permanent heaven and stuff like that.
Right.
But I mean, even keeping those people permanently, like, here's the thing: someone achieved perfect character. If perfect character is like building muscle,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Then I think it can be lost. Like, if
Yep.
people in heaven, like by free will, it can be lost by free will. Someone just decides like, okay, I'm a little bit bored or something, I'm going to go away for a while,
Yeah.
away from people and stuff, for a while, just for a while, just like live alone for a while, and stuff like that. And people do that sometimes, then they
Mhm.
return and stuff like that. So I think if God really values free will that much, I think he should allow people from heaven to part ways sometimes, if they're
If they
considering their
want.
free will.
Yeah, that's an interesting proposal, because because when you look at Christian theology, no one wants to say that. Whereas when I look at like Buddhist and Hindu philosophers, they'll talk about all these different heavenly realms, and you'll have these
Yeah.
really amazing beings that they're there. And then sometimes those beings, like, they do get bored, or they get a bit like their head like gets really big, like their ego gets really big, and they start being really awful, and they get kicked out.
Yeah.
But Christianity just wants to go, no. And we've got some really interesting like kind of like things to say to try to like really dig our heels in and say like, no, you can't have that. But I do find this fascinating that you've got these different intuitions here of going, well, if you really do have the freedom, then like why couldn't you fall from
Yeah, I mean,
grace?
if,
Why
if
couldn't you
it's
fall?
coercion that you are stopping outside people from coming in, then it is coercion to stop people from inside to go out, right?
Yeah. So that's why some of the more recent accounts from people like Tim Paul and Kevin Tempe within Christian thought, um, it's all internal things that keep you there. So it's you've developed this like such a virtuous character that you are so committed to whatever the greatest good is, like God, that you just couldn't anymore. It's just like it's not psychologically possible, and you put yourself into that state, so you're responsible for achieving that kind of virtuous character. But this is actually one of Pat Saladou's arguments against a lot of different views, because she's throwing shade at everyone, to say like, yeah, virtues and vices, those are things that you can get stronger or you could atrophy. So what's going to keep you in hell or keep you in heaven? And Kevin Tempe and Tim Paul, they're like, well, you like your character is so strong, and you continue to develop it even stronger and stronger, but you somehow reach a state where you just couldn't go back. Not everyone's
Somehow
happy with
you
that.
reach a state where you just couldn't go back. I mean, that sounds like something happened. I mean,
Yes.
because the thing is, like, if virtue is like muscle, then
Mhm.
it can be lost, it
Yes.
can be gained, depending on what you want. And it also depends on the environment too. Like, if God's environment is literally the most happiest place ever, it's like better than Denmark, Norway,
Mhm.
and all the countries in the world.
Mhm.
Like, you need a video game, you do this and it pops up. You need
Mhm.
delicious food, you do this and it pops up. you need all the good stuff in the world, then why would you do something extremely stupid to get kicked
Mhm.
out? Perhaps
Yeah.
that's what keeping you not being kicked out from heaven or something
Mhm.
like that, because it's so good that there is no stealing, there is no, killing or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Perhaps that could be it. But I think similarly, if the situation in hell for people who are alone it's worse, then they would want to, I think, come back, every single one
Mhm.
of them, unless they are actually seriously mentally messed up.
Mhm.
So that's my view. And I think if someone says like perfect character keeps people there, and then someone does not have that perfect character, like suppose 90% perfect character, and that person is like closer to God but not that much, perhaps.
Mhm.
So you can lose 90%, you can go from 90 to 89 or 85, but you cannot go from 100 to 95. Like, that seems weird, right? I mean,
Yeah, it does. I agree. I don't know if you could ever get to the 100 because so okay. So here's kind of the idea. So the happier you are and the closer to God you are, supposedly the greater you are in your virtues and your character traits and closer to perfection. But the underlying claim here is though that a creature can never actually fully reach perfection because it's a creature.
yeah,
So there's certain perfections you just cannot have. So you can't have necessary existence or aseity. If it is the case that all of us began to exist, then you could never have eternal existence. You could, because eternity means existing without beginning, without end. And if you
yeah,
began to exist, well, you could exist without end, and that's pretty cool. But you couldn't exist without beginning. So there's certain kind of perfections you just couldn't get. And it
yeah,
seems like you can never get omnipotence because
yeah,
God's the one who gave you your power, so you're not the source of your own power. These kind of
yeah,
things.
yeah,
So there's always going to be you're going to be less than perfect
yeah,
forever and
always.
ever on
And
that. Yeah.
you perhaps like what I was thinking about virtues,
Yeah.
100% virtue, going from
Mhm.
100% virtue to 85 or 70. I mean,
Right.
I think that should be possible if Pat Salady's objection is that free will is so valuable that God should not like to spark in that
Mhm.
person to get that person back. But if that's the case, then people in heaven could, from
Seems like
that
they should be able
single
to go
objection,
back.
go away from God when they thinking or something like that.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, it's interesting. But I mean, yeah, the free will. I think this kind of free will kind of view is perhaps the most plausible version of eternal hell or something.
I find it really plausible, but then when I talk to some of my friends who are like experts on free will, I quickly realize I really don't understand free will that well. Like it gets complicated so fast, and I realize
Yeah.
I'm out of my element.
Have you read the book by her Lauren Ekstrom?
Oh,
Laura
on free
Ekstrom.
will. Yeah, I
Yeah.
just started it. I've not gotten too far into it. So her book on the problem of evil and free and the value of free will.
Yeah.
I'm
I
really
think it's
curious
a
to see
good
how that
book.
goes because I've read some of her papers in the past that have led up to this. So, but yeah, so she no longer is a theist. Is that correct?
Yes, I think she's
Mhm.
not a theist.
Okay, and so then the book's going to argue that like, the value of free will it's not really enough to help with the problem of evil. Is that kind of the big idea?
I think, yeah, I think probably that one. I mean, I read the hell section, you
Mhm.
know,
Oh, okay.
that's the
Well, yeah,
thing
because
that
that's what
I
you're
care
interested in.
about,
So yeah,
you know,
yeah.
that's the thing that I care about the most. So I think she says like, nah, eternal hell is just bad view overall.
Mhm.
From even if you think like we have this free will, I think it's still a bad view overall,
Mhm.
because there are a lot of times when coercion is justified. I mean,
Mhm. I think that's
a
right.
lot of
Yeah.
times. I mean, you you do not get to kill yourself. You do not get to annihilate yourself. I mean, of course, annihilationists would say that you do.
Right. Yeah.
Annihilationists would say that you do, but I do not think that should be done or should be allowed. There should
Yeah.
be some things that must not be allowed,
Yeah, and some of the
so
cases you gave earlier of
yeah,
if your friend is contemplating suicide, you said you're not going to stand idly by,
yeah,
and I think that's the
absolutely,
right moral intuition. It was like, I know this is coercive. I know I'm undermining my friend's freedom at this point,
yeah,
but that seems like the morally right thing to do in this case.
yeah.
So yeah, so I do think there's something to that. I really do.
And
So
as
yeah.
long as you're alive, there's always hope. I think
Mhm.
that's one thing. Like you can always change your mind as long as you're alive, but you're dead, then I mean that's it. You're dead,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. So I think if there is infinite time, then I think everybody will be reconciled. And perhaps I have Hindu influences too.
Mhm.
So I would say that yeah, you can also go back, like go
Mhm.
away from God if you want to. But most people, I think overwhelming majority would not want, only like the really adventurous, like they have like really big ego, like
Yeah.
right.
They're just like, yeah, this is kind of cool, but what's going on in this
I
hell
want
part? And they're like,
suffering. Like
yeah,
if
like I wouldn't
someone
say, yeah.
if someone does stuff like that, like I want that suffering, then perhaps they will be able to get it.
Yeah.
Just like people can consent to like boxing, right? To go
Mhm.
through certain sort of suffering to then come back and feel better. Like,
Mhm.
whoa, I'm not going back.
Yeah.
I'm not going away again from God and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think that might be pretty good too.
It
So,
might be.
anyways,
Yeah.
perhaps we should move on from
Mhm.
this.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
I hope I did not bore you.
No, no, no. That's cool. It's cool.
Okay. So another thing I'm thinking about, like, so population ethics, like, do you know repugnant conclusion? Have you heard about it?
So repugnant is this the view that like humanity just basically needs to die out? Is it something like this?
No, that's not the view. The
Okay. Okay.
repugnant conclusion is in like population ethics, where the I think someone proved that, like, Michael Humer defended the repugnant conclusion, by the way.
Mm.
So the repugnant conclusion is that, let me perhaps, I suppose, let me open that so that you can read it. Perhaps you'll find it interesting. And I think I want to like think about the relationship of repugnant conclusion in population ethics with God,
Mm.
so perhaps that's cool. So let me share it now. Just a second. Okay. So this is repugnant conclusion. For any world full of happy people, a world full of people whose lives were just barely worth living would be better, provided that the latter world contained enough people.
Okay. Okay. So we've got. So I've got. Okay. So I've got a population of people, and as long as everyone at least has a life that's worth living, if just whatever that minimum threshold is,
Yeah.
then creating that kind of world is worth it.
Yeah, it's better than, so suppose
Mhm.
like there are 10 million people and they are very happy, they have like very positive high welfare, right? It's like Denmark.
Mhm.
And then there is another world which has enormous amount of population, not just 10 million, it's like trillion or something.
Mhm.
And in that world, lives of people are barely worth living. The repugnant conclusion states that that world in which people have lives barely worth living is better than the world, which is like Denmark.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. I okay. So I've got some. I guess I've got some different intuitions here. So when I'm looking at one of the things I'm trying to look at is why would God create anything at all, and then why this particular universe instead of any other universe?
yeah,
And a very very standard claim from a lot of theists is that God would only create universes that are what are called creation worthy.
yeah,
They're universes that are more good than evil. And then a bunch of people will add on some other constraints too. They'll say, well, it can't just be simply that like there's just a better balance of good than evil, because it might be that like there's a bunch of people like in Denmark who are like all super super happy, but there's other people whose lives are not worth living at all,
yeah,
and then they'd be like, oh, okay, well those are we can't have that. So so again, like Marilyn Adams, she'll say God has to create a universe where everyone's life is on the whole one that is worth living.
yeah,
And it seems like that would be like just that claim by itself feels like it should be consistent with the repugnant conclusion.
Yeah.
But since we know that Marilyn, we know she's a universalist, we know that she's not going to be ultimately satisfied with this repugnant conclusion, because I don't because she's going to say, I guess so, she this is her argument. She'll go, balancing off evil is not enough. That's not enough, and this repugnant conclusion is just an evil balancing. She thinks that evils have to be defeated. So there's more to the story than simply just a life that's worth living. It's that the evils have to be defeated. So the any evil that you have to suffer, it has to have some kind of organic unity in your life that you can make sense of it, and try to create a new narrative out of that. And God has to be able to make some kind of good out of that, and then give you a life that is, on the whole, one worth living. And so there's other stages, there's other elements of her account of like how God defeats evil, but ultimately she's going to reject the repugnant conclusion. And I feel like I want to do the same, because it does seem like you're just like, it's like barely worth living. It's just enough for you're like, yeah, there's enough goods here in my life that I guess it's okay to keep going. But man, this is not great. This really kind of sucks.
Yeah. So I think
it's hard to maintain.
Yeah. So I think we can also think. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No. That's all I had.
Oh, okay. So one of the thing I was thinking, okay, so like suppose God wanted to actualize. Of course, this is dependent on God. God has like infinite power. So I mean,
Yeah.
He can literally actualize population with very high positive welfare forever. Like,
yeah.
There's no problem with that. So there is no repugnant conclusion. But I thought, like, suppose if we think of God in terms of, like, I think Eugene Nagasawa's maximal kind of God, right? Perhaps that God does not have infinite power, he just has maximal.
Yeah.
And when I'm thinking about that, right? So suppose God has maximal power, and thinking of actualizing two of the possible worlds. In one world is like Denmark, very high positive welfare. And another world is, trillions of people with lives barely worth living. I mean,
it seems like the Denmark world is the one you should create, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems obvious that Denmark should be the one that needs to be created, but repugnant conclusion according to repugnant conclusion, a better world is the world with lives barely worth living, because so many number of people, and stuff like that. So one thing I say is that, look, both worlds are good. One is better, yes, but God does not have any obligation to do this, like go from good to better. Like if God creates Denmark versus God creating this kind of world with lives barely worth living, I think even if God creates any of it, I think it's okay. But considering the loving nature of God, compassion, kindness, happiness, I think he would probably create world which is just good rather than, better than good, I suppose. I mean, because I do not think there should be any obligation on God to continuously maximize the good, because this is the whole thing that kind of bothers me. Because if God is suppose, imagine infinite God, right? Infinite God means God has infinite power, and if he does have obligation to continuously create beings, because existence is good. So does that mean God has obligation to continuously pop in, every second there's one human being is popping up? I do not think that we want to say that God has obligation to create, right?
So so what you're referring to is there's this thing called the Dionysian principle, which is that the good is necessarily diffusive, like it has to create more and more goodness. And you could cut that in terms of obligations, but you don't have to. You could just say that it's some other kind of moral necessity, like it's this, because the way a lot of this usually looks, it's just like God's compelled, and they don't even need to talk about obligations. Just like it just has to, like goodness just has to create more goodness. And if that's the underlying principle for why God creates, then you're gonna get the repugnant conclusion, like because that's maximizing goodness. So it feels weird, right? It really feels weird because you're like, but those lives are just barely worth living. You're like, yeah, but they're above the threshold, so God's got to create them, and it feels wrong. But here's another way to look at it, though. So I'm working on this paper right now. There's a special issue that's going to be dedicated to Dean Zimmerman, and so I'm trying to look at Dean Zimmerman. He's an open theist, and trying to look at how exactly is Dean going to address like different problems that open theism faces, and one of which is this particular problem of creation. Out of all the universes God could create, why this one instead of that one? Why doesn't he create the best possible universe? And if there is no best possible universe, then like, why doesn't he create this one instead of that one? And so we could look at it like this. We could go, well, imagine God, an open theist God, is able to kind of narrow it down to a Denmark universe or a repugnant conclusion universe.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a way that the open theists can talk to look at this differently. And I don't think open theists have been very good about this either. They've usually continued to think in terms of possible worlds where the possible worlds have a fully settled future. Whereas if you're an open theist, you don't think that. You're going to say there's these universes that don't have a settled future. So one thing to say is like, right, God's not obligated to create either. But still, you might think there's some kind of moral constraints or moral considerations. And God might go, well, the repugnant kind of universe, maybe that's the initial stage of the universe. For at least the initial like foreseeable future, it's going to be a repugnant conclusion. Are those creatures at least worth giving a chance? Because since the future is open, it might very well be the case that it starts the first million years are a repugnant conclusion, but after that, they get better.
Yeah.
And so I think if you're an open theist, if God's like that, then God's got other considerations too, which is, I'm a gracious being. And are these the kind of beings that I think are worth giving a chance? And I feel like an open theist should say, yes, like God's the kind of being that would say, I am gracious. These are the kind of beings I want to give a chance. And I do think that I can pull it off. I can eventually get them out of the repugnant conclusion and get them to a Denmark. But I got to start somewhere. And where I start is the repugnant conclusion. That might be the way the open theist would go. But I'm still trying to figure this out. So I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. That's very interesting. I think another thing is perhaps, one thing I thought about like suffering and like these arguments for the existence of God, like if we imagine a world where there is extreme, enormous amounts of suffering, much more than ours, and all human beings, almost everyone is suffering, but there's just one guy who is like Aquinas, and he's like, this is the argument for the existence of God. Like, how much suffering is enough to tell you that God does not exist, right?
Yeah.
Like, that bothers me, right? Like how much?
I don't know, because that's the thing. So Peter Van Wagen has this argument from vagueness, where he's just like, you could never specify how much it is to get you to say this is the amount of suffering that's inconsistent with God. There are some days of the week where I'm like, yeah, okay. And then there are other days of the week where like, if you like today, where you run this exact scenario you just did, where all of like human existence is just pure misery, except for like one guy who is able to sit in an ivory tower and like think about these things. Like his life's really good. He's able to like have time to reflect and think about arguments for the existence of God. But everybody else is just in like a constant state of misery. I want to go, well, that's enough. That's enough suffering to say this is inconsistent with God.
Suffering.
Yeah, I want to say that at least that one is. There's definitely gonna be some vagueness where they draw the line, but that one, it's got to be on the bad side of the line.
Yeah. So I was talking to Joshua Rasmussen, about like, animal suffering and stuff like that. And Dustin Dustin, by the way, have you read Dustin Crumit's paper called, Eschatology for Creeping Things?
No, I've not read that yet. But I know Dustin. Like we were I did a postdoc in Notre Dame, and he was a PhD student there at the time, so I got to have a lot of chats with him. So I've got that paper on my reading list. So I'm really looking for, because Dustin's really bright. He's a lot of fun too.
Yeah. So he believes that animals shall go to heaven. All animals, and perhaps those animals will be in their, innocuous forms. They will not be eating each other alive or something like that, or doing horrific things. Maybe perhaps they will be like Pokemons or something, So animals go to heaven, right? All.
Okay.
But human beings, right? But human beings have to like do certain things to be welcomed at God's kingdom.
Yeah.
I mean, so the thing is, this is why I love the kind of Hindu influences and Christian influences I have, where I'm like, since I'm just a general optimistic theist, I'm not bound by like some kind of, scripture that I have to affirm this, or else I am not a Christian, or, I'm not
you're some dirty heretic, Yeah, exactly.
So
you don't have to worry about that.
From borrowing all of that, I think you can carve a universalist picture that makes sense, that's like really good. So like we are here. One thing you could say is like, by the way, I also read someone's like near-death experience or something, mystical experience, where someone said that we are here because we chose to be here.
Yes.
That sounds like very interesting, because there is consent. That means before coming here, we consented to coming here. So that means that people can go from, one place to another. Perhaps heaven was really good, but we came here to, suffer a little bit, or perhaps have certain kinds of valuable situations that we would not, we would get, but it would take very long time, because, heaven is so great, right? You can think of it that way, like heaven is so good that perhaps there are certain valuable situations that you will take a long time to create. So perhaps we thought like, suffer a little while, high risk and high reward world. And then, once we be based on our like good deeds, good things that we did, we go to heaven. And if we did some bad things, then we go to hell, suffer there for some time, then, released.
Yeah, these are interesting cases. So I've only started reading about these within this last year, about some of these accounts of near-death experiences. And so the kind of story you're telling, so yeah, it goes like this: is like in between death and reincarnation, you've got the option to pick what kind of life you want to live in the next one. And so people, at some point, you'll eventually choose all the different kinds of lives there are. And I don't know what to do with that, because this is still such a new idea to me. But the intuition I have is this, to go, okay, imagine, so Jainists, they're typically supposed to be kind of an atheistic religion, but the Jaina will say that the way to reach enlightenment, to reach like some kind of heavenly state, is to get omniscience. You need to get omniscience. And the way you get that is by somehow incorporating everybody's perspective. And so what it seems to me is like this claim about, in between death and reincarnation, I choose all the possible lives so I can eventually, it seems like you're trying to eventually reach a state of omniscience where you really do fully understand every single different perspective. So you can really reach enlightenment. That seems like that's what's kind of like what's going on here in the background. And I find that really fascinating. But again, like I said, this is such a new idea to me. I don't know how to fully evaluate it.
Personally, that idea sounds, I don't know. That does not sound good, because here's the thing, right? To me, have you read like William Blake's work? I think he imagines heaven in a sort of like Denmark, like perhaps, okay. I think I've heard from my friend that William Blake does this. I have not read William Blake's work, but he says like he imagines Denmark, and you like heaven is like Denmark, but you, I think, perhaps remove horrific suffering, horrors and stuff like that. And we are like, perhaps like listening to music, talking to each other, enjoying our lives forever. Like we are happy. There are like comic books and stuff. Like if someone likes hiking, going on mountain hiking.
Yeah, there's a mountain right here. You can go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So people are like just enjoying themselves throughout, And I think that I like that picture. But the thing with omniscience, like gaining omniscience, I don't know why you would want to get that. And I do not think omniscience, like for a human being, to be a good thing, because we are beings such that we sometimes want to forget things so
Mhm.
that we can enjoy it again later. I think that's
Mhm.
my intuition. Like, I still love Radiohead. Right? I mean, I've heard Radiohead a long time ago. I mean, a few years ago, and I still love them. Right? If there was like 10 years gap and I heard Radiohead again, I think I would be really happy again,
Mhm.
right? To hear those brilliant songs. So I think forgetting can be helpful, useful for
There
happiness.
there are arguments that that would be something needed in heaven, is that there's what's the language they use? And I talk about this envelope that I don't understand why they use that phrase, so I'll get rid of it because it doesn't mean anything to me. But this idea that every so often you would need to forget things so that you could have new experiences, otherwise you'd be bored in heaven, is kind of the argument. I don't foresee really being bored in heaven, but I don't see anything wrong with the idea that human persons in the afterlife would forget certain things. I
Yeah,
just don't see the problem with that,
yeah,
because we forget things now, and sometimes it's a big deal, but sometimes it's not,
sometimes,
because
yeah,
because then you get the joy of reminiscing,
yeah,
and remembering.
nostalgia.
Yes. And so that seems plausible to me. That seems fine with me, that like that would be a joy that could carry on into the afterlife, to
Yeah,
go, oh, do you remember that time when you're like, no, I forgot all about, oh man, let's pull out that Radiohead album. I want to hear Creep right now. Like, like that could be a thing. Like that seems like a pleasurable experience that I don't see why that would have to disappear.
yeah,
Um, yeah, that seems fine to me.
yeah, that's what I thought too. And I mean, the thing is, what since I'm just a general theist, so like I pick out
Mhm.
whatever, you know
Sure.
philosophy or theology that makes sense to me, and say that, like, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so another thing I wanted to perhaps talk
Mhm.
about is like moral anti-realism, and how to
Mhm.
see God from the lens of a moral anti-realist, you know
Mm. Okay. So okay, there's a couple of ways we could go with this. So you could be an anti-realist and say there just are no moral facts at all. Um, or there's this other kind of anti-realism, which I think is really cheeky because I don't think it actually is anti-realism. You could say there aren't these like mind independent moral facts, like your standard moral realism, because they are mind dependent.
yeah.
They're just the moral facts are just ideas in the mind of God.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But it's still pretty close to moral realism, because you've got these necessarily existent claims about what's right and wrong, good or bad, just existing in the mind of God. So they're not mind independent in the way that a lot of moral realists talk, but it's so close that it seems like it's really not that big of a difference. So
Yeah.
if that's the kind of like, if that's what we've got, then I'm like, yeah, there's no big deal then. But if you want to go like further and go like, well, no, there's like there's no necessary moral facts that exist independent of God or in the mind of God. Like any moral facts that are like purely contingent. Is that kind of what you're thinking for an anti-realist?
So I think that, I mean, God is necessary. So are his thoughts necessary?
I want to say some of them are. So like all the necessary truths, those would be things. Everything that's possible, those are necessarily possible. So all the possibilia, those are necessary ideas in the mind of God. Whether or not those things become actual, well, that's a different story. But it's possible that you and I exist. So it's necessarily possible that you and I exist. And so the possibility of us existing, those are necessary ideas in the mind of God.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the the thing with like, uh, so have you heard of Bas van Frassen? He's
Hmm.
a scientific anti-realist, and he is an empiricist, a
Hmm.
stance empiricist.
Yeah.
And his position, like his belief in God, is because of existentialism, not, I think, because of like these arguments for the existence of God, which do similar things to like scientific theories or something like that.
Mhm.
Like, so I think one of the thing with like existentialism, like even if I am like anti-realist, right? I mean, I'm leaning toward anti-realism, by the way,
Okay.
moral anti-realism. And even then, I think our subjective experience is such that there are some things that give us positive experience and there are some
Mhm.
things that give us negative experience. And I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
you could say that those things, the way they are, the way we are, the way God has made this world and the way the God is, that's why we react. That's why, like, so the good is still stands dependent, like it's dependent on God.
Mhm.
No, but it's not truly objective, like it's completely mind independent, even from away from God or something like that. So I
Mm.
mean,
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. But yeah, I'm gonna from a different view. So I'm happy to. Well, okay. Sometimes I'm happy to say the moral facts are they just exist, full stop. I don't need them to be grounded in God or anything like that. Then
yeah,
other days of the week, some people are like, "Oh, but it's Platonism. It's got some problems supposedly for theism. That problems that I can never quite feel the force of." But sure, okay, I'll throw them in the mind of God. Well, there can still be lots of contingent moral facts because I think the necessary moral facts are really thin. They don't tell you a whole lot.
yeah,
So John Duns Scotus, for instance, his claim is that the basic moral facts, the necessary moral facts, they're so thin that they wouldn't even fill out the 10 Commandments. Like, like don't cause unnecessary harm. Okay, cool. Well, what would bring about unnecessary harm? Well, it depends on what kind of creatures exist. It depends on what kind of beings exist and
yeah,
what it would mean to harm them. Okay. So when you look at it from this kind of perspective, TJ Mawson does this, I think, quite well. He'll say these basic moral facts, these necessary moral facts, they're very thin. And when God creates a universe, he starts to fill out a bunch of contingent moral facts that really do fill out what is right or wrong. And you can start to get closer to action guiding principles. So God's got a lot of options about the kinds of universes he could create. He doesn't have options in terms of, can I create a universe where it's a good thing to torture the innocent? Well, no, I couldn't do that.
yeah,
But what it means to torture a person, well, that's going to depend on the kind of creatures he creates. So there's a lot of contingent moral facts. And then from there, there's lots of other things from existentialism I think you can apply, and that again that TJ Mawson does actually do, is to say there's different kinds of objective and subjective meanings,
yeah,
uh, and God might create a universe where his objective meaning is for you to create your own subjective meanings, and so your ability to create meaning, that's
yeah,
objective. Like God
yeah,
wants you to do that, um, and but the subjective meanings that you create, that's part of the objective meaning of life, is to go, I want you to do that, go do that. Do you have a prescribed script of what you need to do? No, but go do that, go create some meaning.
yeah, that,
So yeah, so I think that's a really interesting view.
yeah, I also like that, because that, like, people creating their own subjective meaning is important for like creation. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
our creativity, right? Like, if everybody became an engineer, then there would be no artist, right?
Right.
If everybody became a scientist, then there would be no philosophers like you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, and they wouldn't
So
be asking all the big questions. They would just be like, here's some things that exist, and I don't really care where it came from. I don't know how it got here. I'm just trying to figure out this, like, how this cell works. You're
yeah,
like, yeah, okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So I think subjective meaning is important. So
Mm-hmm.
I do like, Van Frassen's kind of existentialist view.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of have sympathies with his view of critique of metaphysics generally, in general. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, like some of the arguments I see for like eternal conscious torture, like they are on the face indefensible. Like I've seen no good defenses of that. I think they are just completely and indefensible, like
Mm-hmm.
stuff like, if you stole a soda can, right, and then you died unrepentant in that state, then you shall suffer forever, and God will make
Yeah.
sure that you will burn
Yeah.
forever. And I mean, like, interestingly, like, and if you're a disbeliever, so like, I think Islam has like very heavy metal kind of hell, where there is
Yeah.
like actual literal torture going on, and the least
Yeah.
punishment in hell, sorry, not it, I mean, in Islam, I think for Muslims who are believers, it is temporary. But even the
Mhm.
temporary punishment in hell, the least punishment, is like your
Still
feet
pretty
will be
bad.
actually burning, and
Hmm.
it will burn slowly. You will roast up to
Mm.
your head or something like that, and it will be very horrible. And the person who is getting the least punishment will feel like he's getting the most punishment.
Hmm.
I mean, that's just no, no, that's not God. Like,
I think that yes, I agree, because when I look at some of these claims, I'm like, just merely stealing a soda can is worth like forever punishment. That just can't be right. That can't be right.
that
Punishment, sure, but like that extent, that extreme, like, come on. Yes, I agree. I agree on
yeah,
that.
and I mean
Yeah.
that shouldn't be right, right? I mean that
Mhm.
shouldn't be like, it's like walking on eggshells always, even in
Mhm.
heaven, perhaps, considering you have free will. Like,
Yeah, I can see why it would make you, anxious. And the idea of heavenly anxiety, it seems like that shouldn't be there any heavenly anxiety. So yeah, this might be another reason for you to want to reject this kind of view of hell, to go, there shouldn't be any anxiety in heaven, that I might just screw up a little bit and be like, oop, back you go.
yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, one of the reasons I have like great respect for Christianity, because of Joshua Rasmussen,
Hmm.
you, and universalists generally, because I think the free will defense of hell, as you stated, it seems to be like, okay, maybe that's perhaps real, but that does not bother me as much as like literal torture forever,
Yeah. Yeah.
because I think in that world is not beautiful, that world is objectively not beautiful.
Yeah.
That world is objectively bad in my view. Like, that reality is just utterly messed up, to be honest. And
Mhm.
like, I just don't know why would people defend it, like use this metaphysical, just so that kind of, like, really
Yeah.
keeps me away
Hmm.
from this kind of, metaphysical speculation, when you are like, really, you perhaps maybe want to affirm the tradition so much that everything, you want to like
Yeah.
throw hundreds of darts, maybe one will land or something.
Yeah, and I understand that, because I used to be that way too, of going, well, I have to affirm everything in the tradition, but also my view of what was the tradition at that point was really narrow. So it was basically my favorite dead guys. I have to affirm everything that my favorite dead guys said,
Yeah.
and trying to figure out everything I could do to make that work. So I understand that feeling of what that's like to do that. I don't feel the pressure to do that anymore, but I am sympathetic to these people who want to try to do everything they can to make every single thing that one of their favorite dead people said work.
Yeah.
I just don't want to do that anymore, because I think something like, just God's just going to torture these people forever, and be like, it's but why do that? And I don't find the playing with infinity, I don't find those to be good arguments, because I think at some point you're just playing with numbers and you're not talking about reality anymore.
And there's this, like, I did you see my talk with Eric Wrightham?
Yes, I did listen to that one. Yeah.
Yeah, so like one of the thing that came in was like, is God like has to do like these things that like abstract things, like he has to torture you for justice, you know?
Mhm.
And I mean, that just sounds weird. Like, I mean, God's nature is just
Mhm.
loving, compassionate, and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, even before creation, right?
Mhm.
Even before creating God, if suppose like God had blueprints, 10 blueprints, I'm going to actualize one of them. And one of them literally involved like everyone being enjoying themselves, being happy, like having perfect character from start,
Mhm.
just enjoying always. God is enjoying himself, people are enjoying himself, end of the story, everything is good. no one does horrific things, and no one gets tortured forever. But then God decides to actualize our world. And based on our world, I think at least one person would be tortured forever, considering what the traditionalists imply
Right.
about like this dignity of God, and
Yeah.
stuff like that, that God has this infinite dignity, and any crime against such maximal dignity is infinitely severe.
Yeah.
Any infinitely severe crime deserves infinite punishment. I'm like working with like Ben Watkins, Benjamin Blake Speed Watkins. Do you know him?
Only on Facebook.
Oh, okay, cool. So he's an atheist, but I love talking to
He's
atheists.
bright. Yeah.
And like thinking about this, like refining the theism that I hold to, because criticisms are always, helpful.
Oh yeah, very helpful to force you to think about issues you don't always want to, or just you wouldn't have thought of. Yeah, it's very useful, and that's one of the things I appreciate about someone like him and Josh and all these other people we've mentioned. Is it forces me to think more clearly about what do I actually think the world is like, and how do I actually live the good life. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I also hope perhaps my criticisms of perhaps maybe Pat Saladin's work and like work. I mean, we were in some sense like discussing, which is like somewhat of a criticism, like critical approach, right? Where we were talking about universalism and stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, I suppose last question, what kind of normative ethical approach do you take?
Oh gosh, I don't know. So if you look at, okay, so one approach to say is to say you pick one of the big three ethical systems. So either like you go like deontology, utilitarian, or virtue. And then another approach is to be like, well, I don't like any of those three systems because none of them by themselves capture all of the moral landscape. And I think that's right, because I don't think utilitarianism captures the moral landscape very well. I think it captures a few things, but not the whole moral landscape. And then just duties and obligations. Again, I don't think that does it. And virtues, I mean, like, well, why be virtuous? And be like, well, you've got an obligation to be virtuous. You're like, oh, well, no, okay, then there's something I'm missing in the moral landscape. So there's this other view. Sometimes it's either called, sometimes called like principalism or something of the sort, like
moral
this.
Pluralism?
Moral pluralism, like these sort of things. Yeah. And I find those very attractive because as I see it is there are some basic fundamental moral principles. I try to figure out what those are, and then you have to try to figure out how does it fit in this situation. And this is something that Sophie Grace is published on in the past.
Sophie Grace Chapel?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. Yeah. So something that Sophie's published on the past is, in any given situation, it's different kind of intuitions you're going to have. And sometimes it's just going to be an epiphany that comes to you of which moral principle you're relying on in this case.
Yeah.
Because it's not always clear. And I think that does really capture our moral phenomenology, our experience of trying to figure out the right thing to do. So I think there's something to that. But normative ethics is not, it's not something I think about a lot. Trying to figure out what the right thing to do is something I think about a lot, but which theory of normative ethics, I don't. But it's some kind of moral pluralism is where I'd most likely land.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, moral pluralism, I think, is just the best view. Like, I think this whole systematic, like, theorizing and stuff, and people do weird things with these. Like, they bite the bullets and stuff. Like, be eaten by utility monster. Lying to protect all of humanity is immoral. Cutting that grass speck from that grass lawn to save millions of lives because some misanthrope dude did not give you the permission to cut that grass from his grass lawn around his house, because that dude is like misanthrope. He wants 1 million people to die. And the thing is, like, you must not violate rights. Absolute deontology for you. And I mean, that just, no, I mean, look, if there are like these aliens who like, going to kill all the human race, and I need to like give them this grass speck, you
Mhm.
know, of someone's like lawn around their house or something, I will like just pluck that grass and give it to them. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, even if like it violates their property rights, I'll give them like $100 or something. Like,
Yeah.
I'm
I'll just
sorry,
be like,
dude.
I'll just apologize later, be like, sorry, I had to save humanity. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, it just seems like if that's the way the moral world is, then we're living in a very morally perverse world.
yeah,
Is I think when you give all these counterexamples to some of these systems and go like,
yeah.
this just can't be capturing
And
the
the
whole
thing
moral
with
landscape.
virtue ethics is like, what bothers me is with virtue ethics is, I think it sounds like parasitic to other too.
Yes, and there's various arguments for that being the case, and I find those typically pretty plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, like, so Matt Zwolinski and David Schmitz, have you heard about them? They are like libertarian philosophers.
Okay.
So they have like stated how virtue ethics like avoids repugnant conclusion, and I'm like, I'm like, no.
Like
Why?
how? Yeah. Yeah.
Like, how? Like, so they would say like, what would a virtuous person do? And I mean, that depends on theories, right? I mean,
That's the argument I've always found plausible. Is like, what would a virtuous person do? I'm like, I would hope a virtuous person would sit down and figure out what is the good thing to do and what are my network of obligations, and because a virtuous person would try to be rational, and yeah. So I just find I find virtue ethics by itself to be incomplete and to not be very good at action guiding.
yeah.
Which is kind of what you need from a theory of normative ethics. You need to be action guiding. But again, that's not my normative ethics is not my strong area. So someone might be able to give me some arguments for why I'm
Yeah,
wrong.
of course. I mean, I think Linda
Yeah.
Zepsevsky
Mm-hmm.
made like virtue ethics about like role models,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
He wrote a book on like,
Mm-hmm.
there are role models and stuff like that. But the thing was, one of the criticisms was, why pick those particular role models, and
Yep.
when to like do compromise and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
when you like think about these questions, I think again utilitarianism and deontology get in,
Yes.
by the back door.
It
So I
seems right
mean,
to me.
ultimately, like, moral pluralism is like the way to go, rather than like monistic theorizing and stuff like that. Rather than
Mm-hmm.
theory, just act based
Yeah.
on whatever makes sense at that point, I suppose. So yeah, another thing. So sorry,
Mm-hmm.
how much time do you have?
I could do one more thing. One more thing. Yeah.
Okay, sorry to take so much of
It's
your
okay. It's
time.
okay.
So the thing with virtue ethics is that, uh, you can perhaps conjure up another repugnant conclusion, and that's
Mm.
actually perhaps even compatible with God, right? So imagine a country like Denmark, very high positive welfare, people are enjoying chilling out. Now that's one world, people are enjoying themselves. you know there's another world, which is zombie apocalyptic kind of world.
Mm-hmm.
In that world, there are like trillions of people, a large amount of population. And in that world, people have to practice courage with more intensity, more amounts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They have to practice wisdom, because like, if you don't, you are going to die, in that
Mm-hmm.
zombie world. So you have to practice wisdom. You have to practice, what are other virtues? Sobriety, like you cannot just drink when there are like, when you could be attacked by zombies or something.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to practice it more seriously. And there's fourth one, justice. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, people will be very frustrated and annoyed in that world, and
Yeah.
and justice will, if it happens, it will have higher intensity compared to justice in like Denmark. And then there are other three virtues: faith, hope, and charity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Faith, well, when people are really suffering, faith and hope is what they have to keep
Yeah.
them sane.
Seems like all they have left. Yeah.
And then charity, love. I mean, they love each other so much, and they have to like practice it to keep their friends, family together.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise maybe one could get eaten alive by zombies or something. So in the zombie apocalypse world, people are practicing these virtues, honoring these virtues,
Mm-hmm.
in a more significant sense
Yes.
compared to a comfortable place like Denmark, where people are enjoying themselves, their things are easy, so if virtue ethics is like true and God is like maximizing these virtues, then it would be better to make zombie world.
That's what it seems like. Yeah. And it seems like that's an awful world. So
And that's
this is
heaven.
where, well, but yeah. So this is where I think the statements I made about Dean Zimmerman's account earlier, I guess, okay, here's what I think is significant. A lot of times when we're looking at these possible world scenarios, one of the things we're skipping over is the temporal dimension. Like, is it just a Denmark world from the start and it's always a Denmark world forever and ever? Or, is it a zombie world from the start and it's a zombie world forever and ever? Or are there certain stages that a world needs to go through in order to reach a Denmark-like state? It might be the case that you need to have some kind of zombie stuff going on before you get to a Denmark state, to stick with like these two possible worlds. And so that's something I think is missing a lot from the conversations on the problem of evil, at least a lot of the contemporary ones, is this temporal dimension of going, what would it take to get creatures to be virtuous? And saying that's got to factor into the equation of what kind of world God creates. And it's not going to be that way forever and ever. It's eventually going somewhere. But yeah, I don't know, but I don't have that fully developed yet. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So Dr. Ryan,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose I have like after I'm going to like turn off the recording, and after I turn off the recording, I have to like ask you about the feedback about how
Sure.
the interview was and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyways, if so, everyone, if you like the video, be sure to like, you know, like click that like button, and yeah, that's it. So I'm going to stop the recording now.